Good morning. Welcome back. I hope everyone's had their cup of coffee or water or whatever they need to get ready for the second half. It's 10:30, and it's time to resume the second half of the UIC Urban Forum Conference on Closing the Wealth Gap. I'm Michael Pagano, Dean of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at UIC, and I've been honored to be the director of the UIC Urban Forum since its inception in 2011 and 12. This, the ninth year of the Urban Forum, is under the general direction of Professor Janet Smith, and it is the first online Urban Forum event. This is not our preferred format, but in planning for this event, our team agreed that the urgency of addressing the wealth gap won't wait for us to return in person, and the first panel certainly provided grist for the mill, as did Amanda Williams' excellent presentation and art. The second panel, and a closing keynote address by author Heather McGhee, whose book, The Sum of Us, has garnered praise and admiration from across the country, will follow a presentation by the mayor of our city, Mayor Lori Lightfoot. Mayor Lightfoot will address the critical issues confronting the city of Chicago and the efforts of her administration in her first 2 years of office. We are honored that she would prepare a video just for the UIC Urban Forum. Let's listen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, and it's my honor to be a keynote speaker for the UIC Urban Forum this year, which is entitled Closing the Wealth Gap. Since day one of my administration, closing the wealth gap here in Chicago has been one of my highest priorities. Last February 2020, I convened hundreds of community leaders, academics, artists, business leaders, government officials, and more to launch Solutions Towards Ending Poverty, or our STEP program. STEP is a years-long movement-based effort that seeks to address what was then the single greatest challenge our city was facing, entrenched poverty and economic hardship, by accomplishing a handful of concrete goals. These goals include working with communities to define how poverty and economic hardship manifest for them, building a roadmap with communities to show how Chicago can end economic hardship and poverty, creating new opportunities to share, scale, and replicate work that is lifting or can lift residents out of poverty and onto a path of upward mobility, telling new narratives about how economic hardship impacts residents and how they are still finding ways to survive and thrive amidst those struggles, generating the collective will to address the full scale of the economic and social challenges associated with intense poverty and economic hardship, and showcasing partner commitments at all scales that are advancing STEP goals. Though COVID-19 has since joined the list of challenges our city faces, these goals haven't changed. In fact, they've become even more important. COVID-19 has exacerbated the social and economic burdens that our communities, especially those that are low income and primarily Black and brown, have been facing long before this pandemic ever reached our city. As a result, we've decided to take COVID-19 as the once-in-a-generation opportunity it is to eliminate these burdens once and for all. As part of our COVID-19 Recovery Task Force strategy, STEP now plays a key role in our work to recover from this pandemic as equitably and inclusively as possible, and will help residents prepare to take advantage of all the opportunities our post-COVID world is sure to offer. It is also amplified through our ongoing equity-based COVID response initiatives, such as the Racial Equity Rapid Response Team, our data-focused, hyper-local, community-based, and community-driven effort to flatten the COVID-19 mortality curve in Black and brown Chicago, as well as address long-standing systemic inequities, particularly around health care, that these same communities have faced for far too long. And Protect Chicago Plus, a key facet of our equity-based vaccine distribution strategy that drives vaccine to residents of all ages and communities most impacted by this virus. STEP, the Racial Equity Rapid Response Team, and Protect Chicago Plus are just three of many initiatives we have in place to ensure our recovery from COVID-19 is as inclusive and equitable as possible. After all, Closing the wealth gap is a tremendous effort that cannot be solved with one strategy alone, nor can it be done alone. But by making the conscious choice to come together, identify the problem at the root of these issues, and actively work to eradicate them, we can close the socioeconomic chasms that have plagued our residents for far too long. Thank you for this opportunity, and please, everyone, continue to be safe.
Thank you, Mayor Lightfoot, for taking time to share with us the work you and your administration have been undertaking to address equity in our city. As we heard from Amanda, there is a long history of racism and discrimination behind the uneven investment and valuation across our city today. Our next panel aims to help us think about how we can change investment in our communities to increase equity. Helping us to do this today, we're pleased to have Daniel Ash from Chicago Community Trust, Juanita Irizzary from the Friends of the Park, Amy McEwan from Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Facilitating this great panel is my colleague, Rachel Weber, Professor of Urban Planning and Policy here at UIC. As many of you know, her research asks critical questions about investment in our city and communities to help us better understand who benefits and who does not. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Janet, and hello and welcome to the second panel discussion of the UIC Urban Forum, where we will focus on the topic of equitable investment. So it was clear from the opening remarks and from Amanda Williams' great presentation and from the first panel that we have a lot of work to do. We need to repair the racial harm inflicted over the past decades by redlining, restrictive covenants, and contract selling, by the siting of polluting industries in low-income neighborhoods of color, by regressive property tax and fee systems and appraisal techniques, and by the hoarding of resources and wealth by more politically enfranchised people and places. Sadly, Chicago is a poster child for these issues, much studied by scholars and documented by journalists and represented by artists. Luckily, we have a dense network of community organizations and groups that are trying to do something about these issues. So how do we repair that harm? Whether we're talking about private lending, government revenues, or philanthropic support, how do we change the climate in which capital investment and disinvestment decisions are made so that money flows to the places and people most in need? Reversing these patterns of financial exclusion doesn't just involve turning on the faucet. That's what happened to some extent with the subprime crisis several years ago. In thinking about equitable investment, how might we avoid some of these mistakes from the past and from some of the policies that were focused on asset-based development and social welfare that didn't necessarily prepare individuals for the risks that are involved in holding assets? So these issues of financial inclusion and exclusion are tough to deal with, tough to contemplate, tough to resolve. And that's why we have three fantastic panelists with us today. We have Daniel Ash, who is the Associate Vice President for Community Impact for the Chicago Community Trust. We have Juanita Irizzary, who is Executive Director for Friends of the Park. And we have Amy McEwan, who is Chief of Staff for the Chicago Metropolitan Area of Planning, or CMAP. And they're with us to talk about these important issues and to sort of push us toward thinking about solutions and practical strategies. And my job as the moderator is really to gently provoke these wonderful panelists. And I understand that we have about 35 minutes to chat and about 10 minutes to answer questions. And panelists, again, I would urge you to, even though the audience is muted and reserved, I would urge you to feel comfortable jumping in and responding to what others are saying. So let's see, before we start talking about change, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. Any attempts to close the racial wealth gap will occur on an inequitable and unjust landscape, a landscape that sort of has ossified over time. Do we have a shared understanding of the places, businesses, households that cannot access capital And what do you think the main reasons for them being on or left on the financial margins? What are the main reasons why they're there? What are your biggest concerns about this landscape that we've inherited? Amy, I'd like to start with you. Hopefully you can kind of give us the big picture, describing some of the disparities that you see from your perspective with the Regional Planning Agency.
Thank you. Happy to talk about this further. First thing to know is there are disinvested areas across our entire region. They're not located in just one location, but they're plagued by a series of challenges, including sometimes contaminated parcels, obsolete or abandoned buildings, under-maintained infrastructure, low property values, and high tax rates. That one deserves repeating. They have low property values, but because of our structure, they also have high tax rates. So they're at a competitive disadvantage. When you add the restrictive easements and covenants that can go along with long-standing vacant parcels, it really creates an environment that you have layer after layer of barrier and challenge relating to trying to redevelop or reinvest in an area that's been disinvested in for a long time. Making matters worse, the definition of a successful property or project as defined by investors and lenders just isn't coming out of those properties with layered challenges. All of those challenges mean that those types of properties aren't looked at favorably by the measures that lenders or investors typically look at. So if you're looking at a retail establishment and redeveloping an area for retail, they're going to look at what is the income in the area, a quarter mile, a half mile, a mile. If you're looking at an industrial redevelopment, you're going to be looking at what are the incomes and education levels of people that are within a commutable distance to this property. And so oftentimes in disinvested areas, these areas simply don't look like what investors are seeking or looking for in a return on investment or a favorable investment area.
Thank you, Amy. I'm wondering, Juanita, maybe you can jump in, and from your perspective with Friends of the Park, what do you think are some of the sort of systemic barriers to investments in neighborhoods of color, primarily when we're talking about amenities like parks, which places are underparked or under-maintained? Is it always obvious? Sort of how do you know? How do you see this kind of disparate landscape of investment and disinvestment from where you sit?
Well, Friends of the Parks released a report in 2018 called the State of the Parks Report. And what we really saw in the data was that over many years, the city of Chicago had failed to, well, not the city, the park district, had failed to invest in the amount of acreage and the amenities and the programming in parks that historically had been in communities that were mostly African American and Latino. Interestingly, when they did invest in some of the parks that were in the Latino community, it was often in the midst of gentrification, such that the Latinos no longer live near those parks that have been improved. Some of those same issues are now kind of on the table in communities that are lined up to see some major park investment, like in Jackson Park related to the Obama Center, where you now have a coalition that has been saying, wait a minute, we want investment in our park, but we don't want that investment to move us out of the community. So it's a really complicated balance. And from Friends of the Parks point of view, the long-term historic disinvestment in parks and communities of color should be repaired with serious investment in those communities and in those parks in particular, but not in ways that move people out of those neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So it's the sort of the timing is so important, right? It's not about whether the money is there or not. It's when, government agencies decide to invest, and it seems to be strategic and not always to the benefit of existing residents who would take advantage of those amenities. So Daniel, your foundation is focused a lot on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. I'm wondering how you see this issue. What do you think are some of the deep barriers to wealth accumulation, particularly Black and Latinx households?
Well, thank you, Rachel. So yeah, our North Star goal is to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And we've developed a strategy that works on multiple fronts simultaneously to achieve that. We are very focused on household level activity. So we have an entire strategy around growing household wealth. We have a strategy that we call catalyzing neighborhood investment, which is relevant, highly relevant in this conversation. Adjacent to that, we have a portfolio called Building Collective Power, which I lead. And I want to focus there for a moment because just hearing Amy and Juanita sort of set this up is not hard to sort of see sort of a through line that there's been lots of harm, be it intentional or not, done to communities. And the communities we were talking about in the Chicago region are primarily sort of Black and brown communities, Black and Latinx communities that have experienced directly harm. And so as we think about community investment sort of moving forward, as we think about recovery, as we think about equitable investments, you have essentially groups of residents that don't believe the system was designed for them, and the system wasn't. And so we created Building Collective Power because we felt that in order to actually achieve a hairy, audacious goal like close the racial wealth gap, we needed to recreate the conditions to build trust at the neighborhood level and to engage residents and help residents develop the capacity so they could be at these tables, not just being engaged and informing decisions, but having an authority to drive those decisions sort of forward. So again, as I think about this work, and I think about some what the mayor was saying in her remarks just ahead of our panel, I want to just underscore what's important to me is that the priorities that get set by the community. Again, we understand that there's lots of things that need to happen around that, but having a shared set of priorities is so the key element to having community investment actually take root and actually be embraced by community and supported by community. And too often, again, the engagement at the resident level has been very transactional. We listen, but we don't create space for residents to actually be there and drive, control, have authority over the flow of capital once it's created. So I'll stop there, but I want to make sure that theme sort of is present as we have this conversation.
Yes, and I definitely want us to return to this issue because I think that's so important. And I think it's important just for these kind of opening remarks about barriers. You know, we tend to focus on policies and sort of systems, but I think more generally, the issue of kind of political disenfranchisement is a really critical reason why we have not seen money flow to neighborhoods and people who need it. I think that, you know, property is often the basis for political enfranchisement, right? It's the basis for some, you know, sort of NIMBY types of activities, but it's also, you know, sort of homeowners associations and sort of all the things that sort of flow from property ownership that leads to political power is off limits if, you know, you don't own property or you don't have sort of property to sort of organize around. At least that's sort of, it's been a sort of common organizing sort of nub or kind of core in this country and certainly in our cities. So we know from experience that just throwing money at a place doesn't necessarily constitute or result in equitable investment. So I am wondering what kinds of, you know, to get back to Daniel's question, sort of what kinds of capital and projects do disinvested areas most need if they're to reverse these historic patterns? How do you come to articulate these kinds of shared priorities so that it's possible to attract wealth and investment and also anchor that wealth and investment in communities so that long-term residents and businesses and institutions also benefit from those things? And I was hoping, Daniel, we could go back to some of the things you just raised. I mean, as the community foundation for the region, you know, you have a very good view of this, not just the sort of social finance world, you know, program-related investments and donor-advised funds and all these things. But as you said, you know, the trust has been involved in issues of engagement and participation around investment. I'm wondering, how do you build this kind of collective power so maybe you could provide some examples so that you can sort of steer investment and capital to places where it can provide the greatest good. Maybe you could provide a little more detail about some of these efforts.
Well, yeah, I will. I want to make sort of 2 points. First of all, and I want to be very practical in the first level response. Communities have been historically harmed or disinvested. There's been, for many, not all, a significant amount of planning that's occurred. What I hear from folks in the community is that too often good planning is not followed by intentional implementation, like a commitment to implement some of those plans. And so I think we need to sort of call that out, that those communities that have had the pleasure, and think about the list communities that have the pleasure of having access to planning resources. Many feel that, again, there's a gap between, okay, actually, let's make these things happen, particularly when the community has been involved. Sort of stepping back for a moment, we believe, our thesis is that you have to help communities organize, right? And so I know this is a community investment discussion, but I want to talk about the importance of organizing and having really, really healthy organizing infrastructure is, and how it can be beneficial to everything that you need to have in place for good community investment to unfold. We've invested in, at the Trust, 18 community organizing entities. And the idea is that we want them to have greater capacity. And for some, when we launched this work, knowing that our goal was to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap, they thought, well, why do you want to just fund the agitators? And I said, well, no, good organizing is more than agitation. And that's an important tool that organizers use in order to make sure that their voices are heard. But the organizers are also the entities that are helping the community sort of set its priorities. And a key point I want to sort of make here is, I've heard from my colleagues that community development, when it's done right, is going to be sort of multi-layered. Like, there are lots of deals that need to be put on, or be put in a pipeline and be organized. I can't think of a better entity to sort of helping to organize that pipeline than organizers themselves. So, getting the church that wants to have an expansion, getting the sort of business owner that wants to reimagine a business corridor, the developer that wants to sort of build some affordable housing, creating the conditions where all of those stakeholders that are grounded in community, of the community, can be in a position to sort of not only map its landscape, but actually organize its landscape, and then bring that agenda, if you will, to the table with government, corporations, and others who have access to capital and want capital to flow into these communities. So again, it's not organizing just for the sake of old school Saul Alinsky organizing. It's organizing knowing that infrastructure is absolutely vital to creating the conditions for having a shared priorities, having a really, really strategic pipeline of deals, and creating the conditions where all of this can actually unfold in a healthy and timely manner.
Good. So putting that, the kind of sort of social infrastructure together, and the deals, and making sure that the right people are at the table, so that investors, getting back to Amy's point, feel more comfortable, sort of see particular, areas that may have been erased or invisible to them before. You do that through sort of organizing and agitating. I guess I want to go back to you, Amy, in terms of a point that Daniel made about the sort of, we want the plans implemented, that it's that disenfranchisement happens, or sort of apathy about community process and organizing takes place, because particularly in low-income neighborhoods of color, individuals feel like, we've already been involved in this planning process before. We already came out for that, planning process and for this study, and you surveyed us about X, Y, and Z, and what happened? We're still in the same sort of situation. How does the regional planning organization focus on pushing plans through to the implementation part? So you really see the, sort of material outcomes and effects of those planning processes, and you don't just contribute to this sense of, we've already been here before. We know how this movie ends.
Certainly, I'll give you a couple examples. So recently, CMAP has been working to apply our equity lens to public funding and how public funding is allocated. And I'll give you one area of transportation funding that we've specifically been working on. So CMAP does modeling and uses lots of data and information and has identified communities within our region who are considered to have challenges as it relates to being low income, low capacity, and doesn't have a lot of investment, isn't just invested area. And so you can apply that. And then when you are looking at applications for, we're going to use road funding, for road funding in our region, you can apply factors that provide, I'll call it extra points for communities that are disinvested. So CMAP has been utilizing this model to provide funding across the region in certain areas, and it has been shown to be effective in more projects going to disinvested areas. Another example of using this was we collaborated with Cook County when they received their CARE funds to also look at disinvested areas and help them create a strategy to provide a greater incentive for those dollars to go to the disinvested areas, so that when you're really using a point system to determine how public dollars will be allocated, you're utilizing and recognizing through that data those areas that are disinvested, and they're set as a higher priority in your strategy.
Great. So you're weighting the models in some ways to try to sort of right these wrongs in ways that previous models did not, right? There is a kind of a race blind, effect when you are allocating money, or, and I think that it's an important move in that right direction to try to unbake racism, out of these kinds of systems. Juanita, I'm wondering maybe you could provide an example of what Daniel's talking about when you talk about participatory park planning or community organizing around, investment in amenities and infrastructure. Can you point to examples where you think it was, this was done particularly well, or that the organizing really led to important sort of tangible effects that made people realize the value of that kind of engagement?
Mm-hmm. Wow, I have more examples of how it has not yet worked well in Chicago than I do examples of it working well. And I'd actually like to kind of go back to some of Daniel's comments to set some context of my own involvement in the space as someone who's lived 50 years in the Humboldt Park, Logan Square area, right along the border between those community areas, which happens to be now the 606 Trail. And I got involved as someone working in affordable housing and community development back in the middle 90s, and was part of the Humboldt Park Empowerment Partnership, which got together, having not been included in empowerment zone dollars, but decided that we were going to do the community organizing around the plan that we had created anyway, which led to eventually groups like Bickerdike Redevelopment Corporation and Logan Square Neighborhood Association being centered as quality of life planning organizations through LISC, and both of those groups being very at the early stages of identifying the need for more parkland in our communities. I was actually at the affordable housing table when that first Bickerdike plan came out, but at that same time, there were others saying we need to be able to walk safely, we need more green space per capita, which led to some of the ideas that became what is now the Bloomingdale Trail and the 606. But fast forward many years, honestly, a lot of those conversations and the attention to those things got hijacked by folks who are not people of color, some of whom are now my friends after we've worked for many years through the challenges of what it means for the communities of color who actually initiated a lot of that thinking to be pushed aside in the planning. And then for, a mayor who is not now our mayor to really take that as a key initiative of his, but really make it about property values going up to help the tax base of Chicago, rather than about folks in the community actually having parkland nearby. And I often tell the story about the fact that I've lived within walking distance of that trail for those 50 years, and was living on the block of the trail for about 5 years as it was being developed. And by the way, I only really learned what was going on at that planning table because I was a program officer at the time at the Chicago Community Trust, and I was reading proposals about that work, but not hearing about it in the neighborhood because folks weren't knocking on my door. And so when I went to get involved in it, learned that, a lot of the momentum around it became about how we increase property values. So in the end, my own rent went up $150 a month a year after the trail was opened. And I don't live there anymore. Now, I still live within the area of study when folks are looking at, how much impact the 606 has had on rents and home ownership. And I fortunately was in a place to just hurry up and buy a house. But I have to walk so far now to get to the 606 that I actually don't walk on the 606 very often, because by the time I walk there, I've already taken my walk. So, these things often are related to community development. But what my experience has been in a space that has been defined by gentrification for 20 years is that eventually the market and government come together to push the people out who've been doing the work. Right. And so that is my challenge, I guess, back to Daniel is, there are folks who've been doing this work for decades, but who find the exchange of zoning favors for campaign contributions to get in the way, and who find the definition of my neighborhood being better as me not living here anymore to be a really prevailing message. And even if it's not said out loud, in front of us, it gets said. And I have a lot of experience around that because I am a very light-skinned Latina who often does get to hear it, actually. So, we really need to ask ourselves, as the corporate partners who have not yet finished the parks on the west end of the Bloomingdale Trail, yet are, getting subsidy for new extension of the 606 through Lincoln Yards, what are those corporate partners doing to finish the project that impacts the west end of the park if we really care about equity? So that's kind of my context for these conversations.
Daniel.
Thank you, Rachel. I just want to sort of double down on a point that I heard Amy make and Juanita just lifted up. And it's the importance of sort of transparency and visibility. When Amy talks about the modeling that they're doing, which I think is absolutely important work, and that type of data analysis has to guide investments. And if you're talking about equity, it's like we need to overinvest in communities that have been underinvested, right? Simply put. But what's important, particularly as you think about sort of resident engagement and sort of having sort of resident power at these tables, is that anyone involved in this ecosystem, corporate, government, philanthropy, community, we have to commit to transparency so that everyone understands what's actually happening. Right now in this city, in this region, I mean, we're dealing with decades of opaqueness, right, of deceit, where things are promised but not delivered. And so as we think about this moment that we're in and we think about the recovery, I mean, we have to be multi-sector in our approach, but each sector has to be fully committed to pulling back the curtain so that the community can see what decisions are being made. One example I want to bring up, which I really love a program that's housed at the Trust, but I would argue this is sort of anchored in community. It's called Elevate Chicago, which is an initiative that's designed to help communities that have been disinvested truly leverage the incentives associated with transit-oriented development. What I appreciate about that work is that it's very specific, so we've identified transit stops along the L that need to be that are ripe for development, and the community is at the sort of center of that process. And there's a commitment to values that are going to guide the work. I would argue that program is a model that should be, in terms of its sort of tenets and the covenant that it creates with the community, that should be replicated with every community development initiative in the city. And I would even argue the initiatives that, like you talk about, the big Lincoln Yards investment, I would even argue when there's significant public dollars in play, those initiatives also adopt these same type of principles of transparency and community engagement, so that in doing that, we reimagine our civic culture, right? We imagine like the practice of doing this work is not in the back room where deals are getting made. The deals are being made in the public square. And if we can achieve that, I think we'll find ourselves on a pathway to a recovery where every community is being lifted, and residents that have been harmed historically are now benefiting from decision making that's made at the public level.
Amy, do you have comments about the sort of transparency and visibility aspects of investment and planning? I mean, that is one of the models that we use, or these kinds of, appraisal systems. Like, that's one of the downsides, is that it's very hard to figure out sort of all the different factors or variables that are going into them, or it's a spreadsheet model, right? And it's not something that is sexy and that you advertise and sort of show how you use. How have you been able to promote and sort of communicate the value of the kinds of technical tools that that planners use to try to reverse these patterns of disinvestment?
So I'm hopeful that the pandemic actually helps with this challenge. And the reason being is that if you're working 2 jobs and you have a longer transportation route to get between your home and your jobs, which is very frequent for people who live in disinvested areas, you don't necessarily have the time or the energy to go to a public meeting at 7 o'clock on Tuesday, right? You may or may not have childcare access. And so beyond our interest in hearing from people in that condition, they simply don't have the time or energy to necessarily dedicate in large quantities. And so perhaps providing many different types of ways to get involved in a particular community project or community development initiative. We're working on an equitable engagement model, I'll call it, that is going to talk with communities about the different types of engagement communities can use to be able to access hard to reach populations who aren't necessarily available during the city council time. And so I think part of it is that diversity of opportunity to participate, and then understanding the ability of your different populations to participate, what time of day, all different kinds of factors like that when we look at equitable engagement.
But I also think that transparency and visibility and, kind of lowering the barriers to participation, which is what it sounds like, Amy, that you all are doing, it's so important to leading to more equitable outcomes. But I still harbor a concern about the inflationary effects of investment. Mm-hmm. Even in the case, Daniel, of the TOD planning that you've got going with the Elevate Chicago. I mean, it sounds like an amazing process. Mm-hmm. And you're bringing all people to the table who, again, stand to potentially benefit or be displaced and dislocated by that investment. Or, getting back to Juanita's example, you've got this investment in this, elevated park, basically, and this the 606 or the Bloomingdale Trail. But people like herself and others obviously have been displaced, and making those places less accessible, particularly to folks with lower incomes, or just people are unable to buy or rent in the area anymore. It's in addition to just the dislocation and the displacement. There are sort of high barriers to entry. Mm-hmm. What are ways in which we can kind of manage those inflationary effects of investment, whether it's public investment, private, nonprofit, and roll out capital projects in ways where existing community residents and businesses or, the neighborhood stands to benefit more? Is the answer ownership, collective ownership, as many people have pointed to land trusts and cooperatives, that we need to have, particularly people of color being the owners of capital, of property, so that they are less at risk for these kinds of displacements. And yet ownership comes with its own risks. So I guess, Daniel, maybe we'll start with you. What's the end product of these TOD planning processes?
Well, I think with any initiative, and that's just one example, it's a kind of an all of the above approach, right? And so 2 points I want to make in terms of framing my response. One, the inflationary sort of impact is not. We want inflationary impact. We just want to make sure that the beneficiaries of that inflationary impact are folks who have been indigenous to these communities. And I do think ownership is a critical issue. And I think ownership will manifest in many ways, myriad ways moving forward. And so the challenge to us is to create the condition for sort of those opportunities to unfold at the individual household level, the collective level, the cooperative level, and let communities sort of and trust that communities will sort of sort themselves out and find themselves in the right lanes. Give you an example, and again, just for the sake of audience context, I live in a community that is experiencing this dynamic right now. I live in Woodlawn, a few blocks south from the University of Chicago, and I've been here for approximately 20 years. And there are homeowners who are very, very, very committed to the idea of remaining homeowners, but also becoming developers at a micro level. They want to buy the 6 flat, the 3 flat. They want to acquire the property near their home, in some cases adjacent to their home. And so the question is, like, how do we create pathways for these homeowners to, expand, access the capital they need to sort of realize some of their dreams? And many of these homeowners are also the type of these homeowners who want to become developers. They're bringing mission, if you will, and community centeredness sort of to that work. So they're thinking about, how do I acquire property, not just so I can cash in, but so that I can offer affordable rent to folks so that they know need it. And these are real examples. Another example, and this is in the Pilsen community, so you have residents coming together, working in partnership with the Resurrection Project to buy buildings, and they sell the units, the cooperative units, to folks who are in the community. How do we create the conditions for more of that to come online? The last point I want to make, and I want to double back to the organizers I mentioned earlier. Many of our organizing institutions are also, they're either directly adjacent to the developers or they're becoming developers themselves. I'm going to give you a very simple example. Aisha Butler, who runs RAGE, the Resident Association of Greater Englewood, they do everything from good old-fashioned organizing to food relief, food pantry work, safety, community safety work, community arts projects. But they're also now purchasing homes and renovating. So again, it's when you think about development and you think about the complexity of development, how do we create the conditions for that capacity to grow? I make one final point, I promise. There's a resource that the trust is associated with called the Community Desk. The woman who runs it is named Juanita DeFell, and she's worked closely with one of my grant recipients, a grant recipient in my portfolio, to help them build their skills and acquire the knowledge and information needed to secure a loan to acquire a mansion in historic Bronzeville. And there's a plan that's grounded in community, revitalize that mansion into a business, a home for a business that is already existing. What that Community Desk resource provided is sort of like that last leg of like getting you ready to actually walk into the room at the IFF and actually manage that moment and strategically and actually secure the loan. Absent that type of technical assistance, that you wouldn't see it. So when I talk about how do we create the conditions for these folks who are indigenous to community to be owners, we need more resources like that to come online to make sure that they're able to be at these tables and be at these tables with confidence.
Good. No, it's great to hear. Janae was a former student of mine, so it's nice to hear. It sounds like, Daniel, what you're talking about are sort of resources for small scale developers and landlords, and particularly landlords and developers who come from the community. right? It may be that it's not as not everybody can just make that transition very seamlessly. There are a lot of, you need capital, obviously, to keep up a building, to buy the building, but also to maintain it to standards. And, there is a question of how do we sort of self-select for kind of the right-minded kinds of developers and landlords, as opposed to those who simply want to speculate on the property. Juanita, any thoughts about this kind of anchoring community wealth in communities? What are options for that without increasing appreciation and displacement?
Well, I actually want to anchor my response to that in that I don't think we should assume we have the answers, first of all. And I wanted to say to Amy's point that I think part of the challenges of community engagement processes is that there is not often a real commitment to actually hearing what we hear from the community and integrating it and making that change the outcome, right? Or actually having us think differently than where we were already headed. And so, it reflects a lot of tension, which I also hear in what Daniel's talking about as someone who worked in a community development organization that both built affordable housing and supported organizing. And over time in my own community, the organizers and the affordable housing developers have become pitted against each other as the developers have had to function within the restraints and restrictions and the challenges of the context they work in. It can't always be as radical as the organizers, right? So there's always going to be tension. And then I, set that in the context of park space for Friends of the Parks. We think about ownership in a lot of ways. And one of those is community sense of ownership of the local park or green space, right? And so for many years, we've really centered organizing in parks or around parks through park advisory councils, but are also really excited about the park advisory councils in marginalized communities most often have a lot of power by being connected to a local community organizing group, right? So for example, we've seen Kelly Park get great support because Brighton Park Neighborhood Council realized that their safety goals were wrapped up into ownership by the community of Kelly Park, and that there was a lot of investment that should come in through the Chicago Park District. And because that Brighton Park Neighborhood Council put so much energy into developing the Park Advisory Council and even letting some of their staff use staff time for this otherwise volunteer entity, it has made a big difference in the community then being able to say, this is what we think this park needs in terms of amenities. It serves both the high school and the broader community, right? So, for us, then how do we center the voice of that community, whether it's the Park Advisory Council, sometimes it's some other park partner, in saying what is the right kind of investment in this community? And that's related to a phrase that's out there in the environmental world around parks and in conversations about environmental gentrification. And the phrase is called green enough. And it's talking about how do you surface from the community what the right investment is so that it's not an investment in the Millennium Park South if what the community is asking for is a different kind of investment in their park, right? And how do you decide who gets to be at the table in those discussions, right? There's no one right answer to that, but you're not going to get there if the community folks are only brought in a token way to speak for 2 minutes at a public meeting where their point of view was never really going to be taken into consideration. So there's an awful lot about process that I think we're really still working on here in Chicago around, whether the voice of the community really is more than just a token representation. We see that in massive fights around environmental justice in the 10th Ward related to General Iron, which is also right across the street from Rowan Park. So therefore, we're really involved in that as well. But, we can support community organizing all we want, but if the powers that be really only see that as like a little fly on the wall or a gnat to wave away, but not a true partner in what's best for the community, then we have a long way to go.
Well said. It does seem like sometimes these processes are so highly choreographed and the community residents simply come in at the end. It's like to sort of validate what has already taken place. We have several questions that I'd like to pose to our presenters, and I wanted to thank our presenters again. I just feel like you've touched on so many important issues and given us so much food for thought. One of the first questions I think I'm going to address to Daniel, it's really about organizing, and it's about, kind of bringing in some fresh blood. Right, Chicago's has this storied history of community organizing and a lot of advocacy groups and a particular sort of, roll up your sleeves kind of style of organizing. Mm-hmm. But it's often the same people and same organizations that we see at the table over and over again. How do you bring in sort of the next generation of community organizers, and how do you empower them and enable them to participate in some of these processes, some of which are very kind of inside baseball? It's like you have to have lived in the neighborhood for a while. You have to understand sort of who has power, where the money really is. But how do you bring in the youth and sort of the next generation of folks who are going to take on these struggles?
Well, first of all, let me make, I'm going to answer this from the perspective of the trust. 2 points. One, there are a lot of new sort of youth-driven, young adult-driven sort of organizing entities that are active in our region. So we need to acknowledge that, and they're not waiting for anyone to endorse them. They're just picking up issues that need to be picked up and advancing that cause. What we're trying to do at the Trust is use our position as a funder, convener, to connect legacy organizing entities with emergent ones. And so we've created, as part of our portfolio, a network which we call the Changemakers Network. And so we fund these entities with capacity building grants or general operating grants, and we've created the conditions for these grant recipients to create a community of practice, and we put ourselves in service of that community. So it's not people convening because I've called the meeting. It's they're coming together because they want to develop relationships with one another. And we've seen some powerful sort of outcomes already. And again, this is just about a year old. Another initiative I want to sort of lift up is a program I'm involved in called the Chicago Racial Justice Pooled Fund. A number of us in philanthropy came together as the pandemic was unfolding, the social unrest of the summer was emerging. And we felt that we needed to respond to those folks who were creating and leading the movement for social justice and racial justice. So we've been able to, I'm oversimplifying the process, it's taken some time, but we've been able to create a fund where we're funding organizing, general operating grants. In addition to just funding and sort of helping to build that infrastructure, we are being intentional about, again, creating network relationships so that one generation can speak to another generation, so that our Latinx organizers are connected to our Black organizers, our Asian organizers are connected to the broader network, and so on and so forth. Again, it's important that these groups learn from one another and develop relationships with one another, but we have to be intentional about creating those bridges. Too often, this is although we have some beautiful bridges in the city, in our built environment, socially and politically, we're not known for being a city that creates bridging opportunities.
Thank you.
And again, I think we have to lean into that.
I agree. We're almost out of time, and I want to make sure that that Amy and Juanita can also answer this question that I think is very provocative, which is also about bridges and bridging, which is infrastructures that bridge neighborhoods. So the 606 cuts through 4 different community areas, is it? And I think, Amy, involved in the regional, with the regional focus, you see infrastructures that are not just anchored in one particular community, but that bridge. And those seem to be potential organizing opportunities because they're bringing people sort of out of their communities, potentially in their neighborhoods, to sort of talk through these spaces and infrastructures that span multiple ones. What are some of the challenges of organizing around those? And do you also think that those are sort of, that there's a lot of potential there in infrastructures or spaces that are bridging? Amy, if you could just a couple of words, and Juanita, and then I think we've got to wrap up.
Certainly. I think it provides great context as well as understanding that communities adjacent to one another don't always have the same goals. And so having those conversations where you hear your neighbor have a different goal than you have, or your neighboring community, is important. And then documenting what all of those values, those directional goals that the different communities have, and looking for commonality and where you can achieve common goals together is really, really important when you are doing cross agency projects, cross-line projects, so that you are hearing those different voices. One of the positives, though, is we want a mixture of different types of people in every category. Those are our strongest communities. So defining our community a little broader in the case of a shared infrastructure is a great way of doing that.
Thank you. Juanita, last word.
Yeah, I'll quickly say that for us, we think park advisory councils are a really important tool in that space. And one of the things that we've been doing, and it feels like a tiny little drop in a bucket, but we have grasped onto this racial healing circle process and have been intentional about bringing people together. We started actually in neighborhoods around Jackson Park, bringing together people that we know disagree with each other, both, and they're not people, all Black people don't have one opinion, all white people don't have one opinion, but people that we know are willing to go through some work together to get to know each other a little better and then talk through their differences. Not just about the policy issue that they all might think we're going to bring up that day, which we don't actually, but just developing relationships so people can then work on these policy projects together across.
Now, those are great spaces for being able to hear a diverse set of voices and, these kinds of what Daniel was multiracial, multi-generational, right? So many different people use those parks. And they span such sort of broad geographies. It does sound like the advisory councils are sort of a perfect space for those kinds of conversations. So I recognize that we are out of time, I believe. So I'm going to have to thank our wonderful panelists. It was such a nice opportunity to be able to spend time with you this sunny morning. And I feel like we've touched on so many important issues. We haven't resolved or fixed the world, but I think just sort of knowing you're in it makes me a little more optimistic about our chances of doing so. So again, thank you so much. And we are on to the next event.
Thank you.
Goodbye.